one of the worst things that can happen once a death happens is a surprise to the surviving spouse. If they feel surprised, they feel like, I should have known something and you didn't tell me because you had the knowledge, you participated in helping us set up this plan and you had that knowledge, but I didn't get it. That's like kind of that worst kind of breach of trust and the most likely reason they're going to kind of bounce.
All right, what is up? And welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Practical Planner Podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Kopelman, and here with me is Rhodes and then Lisa Weigel. So if you haven't checked out the last episode, Lisa's been on. This is her second time. And the topic we're talking about today was supposed to be last time. I totally butchered it. I got to share the story. So we all hopped on for the last episode. And I just, they told me we were talking about widows. And all of a sudden, I just had a whole conversation and we were talking about divorce. Somehow they went with it. We had a great episode off the fly with no preparation. And that's on me. But today we're actually going to do the topic that we were planning for. And I think, for advisors, there's a lot of times in our life where, people say like, okay, what do you do on a yearly basis? How do you help people? And there are for sure years where things are kind of status quo, right? Like we're helping, maybe things are maintaining, we're keeping pushing things forward. But then there's other times where like our value is immense, right? There's things that you really have to step up, things that maybe you didn't prepare for. And I think losing a spouse has got to be one of the most impactful times for, an advisor in a client's life. On my last podcast, I actually hosted it with Jacob Turner. And when he was a pro baseball player, he said his sole reason of hiring a financial advisor was because he didn't know what his wife would do if he were to pass away, right? We know that most families, there's a money spouse and a non-money spouse. And if the non-money spouse passes away, obviously super sad, we have all those issues, but the other spouse might be able to kind of handle things moving forward on the financial side. But if the other one passes away, things are really tough. They don't really know what's going on. They don't know where all the money is. They don't know how to manage it. And so like, this is, I think, one of the most important topics that we can talk about. So I'm excited to talk about this one, even though it's a really sad topic, and just go between the, obviously there's like the, how do you prepare? There's the estate planning, there's the financial planning. But, Anne, I'm going to kind of kick this off to you to start. Obviously the conversation happens before somebody's a widow, but I think we take this conversation like this happened, right? And, maybe it's a new client, maybe it's an existing client, but where do you start as the advisor with this when a widow comes in?
Yeah, I think of it as taking place over the course of 3 stages, that relationship that you develop with the primary spouse in the relationship. And here, I think we're going to refer to these people as widows, but some of this is obviously transposable to like a widower. Most often, I think financial advisors say like their primary relationship is with the husband, and then the wife is sort of like more of a like tag along member. Yes, she signed documents, but are you truly meeting with her? So I think the first phase of the relationship definitely is while both spouses are still alive, and we'll talk a little bit about that because you need to set them up for success. Death, taxes are 2 of the only things that are sure about life. And so you would be doing yourself a disservice, but also the couple a disservice by not thinking about phase 1 as the preparation step for phase 2. And phase 2 is really, one of the spouse now is deceased. And there is, an amount of frenetic activity, as, Thomas, you're probably hinting at, for that second phase of the relationship, which is, usually, I want to say like 3 months to 2 years, if things are not controversial. Things are controversial with the family or, between advisor and client, like that timeline is out the window. But 2 years is a good rule of thumb where you really have an exceptional opportunity to step up for the person who's left. And then there's the third phase, which is maintenance and maintaining that relationship. And sort of, to your point, Thomas, it kind of goes back into this like, things are normal and you're doing your normal, checklist items with these people. So I would say, and here, Lisa, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but how do you set up a couple for success maybe with more of an estate planning lens in that first phase of the relationship.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's so critical to estate planning is always talking about different phases in life, right? You're not just taking a snapshot in that moment. Our job as estate planners and financial planners as well is to be looking ahead and sort of map out all the potential branches of like, well, what if this happens and what if that happens? And obviously a big part of that is like at some point someone will pass away in the married, couple relationship. And so, making sure that everybody understands, hey, this is what happens at the first death, and this is what's going to happen at the second death. A lot of times, the primary focus when a couple sits down to do their estate planning is sort of the second death scenario. But there's so much that happens at that first death where, depending on how their estate plan is structured and where they live, you potentially are having, a trust split into shares, and how, how each of those shares are managed can be different. So just making sure everybody is understands what the mechanics are going to be. And I think most importantly, we always drive home, you should be calling your financial advisor, you should be calling your estate planning attorney, your CPA, first thing, because there's so many little things that have to happen in the beginning, elections and, making sure you get a handle on the finances. And so just letting them know, like just call somebody. You don't have to know it all. Just call your trusted advisor and get the ball rolling that way.
Yeah, the hardest part I think about phase one is where you have a profile for that couple where you know that there might be some, like a spouse who's maybe a little bit more dominant in terms of like how they think about the estate plan. And you as an advisor, financial advisor, but also the estate planner is in the same boat where you're like, this is not very even, like what they want out of the estate plan. Like if she dies first versus he dies first, there might be vastly different, plans. And usually, most of your clients will just have mirror plans of each other, right? It's like, okay, if they want a marital trust, it's like, regardless of which spouse passes away, like there will be a marital trust. But every so often you get those situations where like, it's not even. And maybe it's as simple even as like, you have one richer spouse, and if he passes away first, he feels comfortable that he's leaving enough of his estate to be able to make large gifts. So like, to their alma mater or to, some like the basketball program. I've been watching a lot of basketball lately. But so you have, those like specific gifts coming out. Whereas like if she passes away first, like everything just goes to him and there are no like big gifts or something like that. So like watch out for those things that make things a little bit uneven. But it's also like usually there will be a spouse who like might be younger, and it's expected that the spouse might remarry or keep living for just a very long time beyond the other spouse. And that can create some sort of like tension as well in the estate plan. And I would just say, like, when that happens, don't just shy away from that conversation. I think it's super important for the like lesser, the spouse with less of a voice or who's not nearly as involved to really understand what the plan is, because taking that time is what then builds the trust that you are looking out for them, right, and wanting to do what's best for the whole couple, for when things happen and one of the spouses has passed away.
Super interesting. I feel like, so in this phase, right, there's the like estate planning. So there's the complexities, but there's also the simplicity, right? Like the advisor's role here is like, it doesn't matter how young you are, you need to get your estate plan in place. Like I'm walking through this with a client of mine friend of mine passed away last year at 29 years old with a wife, right? Not everything was done, not everything was organized. And, you think that, hey, maybe estate planning in general is for high net worth people or the 60 plus year olds. But in reality, like our job as the advisor is to push into it. Obviously, it's part of Wealth's mission. It's part of why advisors use something like Wealth, is it's an easier way to help implement and help people actually get an estate plan done and kind of take away some of the barriers that have existed. I also think it's, in this phase is helping people get organized. So like, one reason of hiring an advisor, like I said, is helping make sure that there's somebody to guide you through this. If anything were to happen, God forbid it happens, it's the advisor pushing to make sure, hey, they have life insurance or other things. So if one person isn't here, that those needs are protected. But I also think it's making sure that other spouse knows where everything is. And so there's all of these, like you can find them online. Mark Ciccini has a pretty good one on it. That's like the if I'm no longer here sheet that kind of has everything. And I think this is really important and something advisors can help push people to or give them a template of like, okay, where are our retirement accounts? Where is our life insurance with? Where is our estate plan held? Where is our investment accounts held? But then even things as like hey, here's who our lawn service is, here's who our cleaning, all these people, because maybe one person is overseeing that and you leave, that person's no longer here. And you're like, oh my gosh, our whole life is kind of unorganized now. I don't know where anything and everything is. And so I think that's like one way to really help get prepared that isn't very fun. And then I think there's also the side of those websites that you can store personal information, right? Credit card numbers and social security numbers and logins to potentially crypto accounts or things that are hard to have. Like I know if I were to pass away, my wife doesn't know where anything is. So I need a sheet like that because she would have no idea where our investments are, where my HSA is, or, all those miscellaneous things are.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think the biggest thing, we see all the time in private practice, I can't tell you the number of clients that it would, as Ann said, there's like a more dominant spouse a lot of time in the conversation. And then the one that's, the dominant spouse is like, oh, they're not interested, they're not going to come to these meetings. And it just, they have no clue where anything is when that more dominant spouse passes away. And it's overwhelming. It's a crazy amount of work for someone to have to step in and just figure out where everything is. So I think those tools are incredibly helpful. And I think that's really where the financial advisor can be such a critical bridge to that person if they've already set up a relationship. And so it's hard, I think, sometimes to insert yourself and say hey, I really want to talk to you, not super dominant spouse, about, strategy or why we're doing these investments the way that we are, because they're going to remember that on the back end too and say, hey, that person really did reach out to me, even if it wasn't important to them during their life. And they were like, okay, fine, whatever, I'll sit for this meeting. I think, a lot of times they'll remember oh, they did care about me as well and wanted to make sure, I was informed to some degree, and have that outlet, to reach out to.
Here's my practical tip for this episode: to set yourself up to get the phone call when phase 2 comes to pass. You have to ask yourself today with the clients who are alive or both spouses are alive, do you know if both spouses would want to pick up the phone and call you today if something were to happen? Do you know where each of the spouses kind of gets their advice? Who is in their trusted circle when they make decisions about finances, life or death, etc.? Because one of the things that I think is underappreciated about widows and women and the way that women make decisions, and this is something that apparently has been written about a lot, is that the way that they get information can be very different from the male spouse, the husband. So women tend to have different circles of trust. They might rely much more on their friends to give them, information and recommendations than your traditional, hey, if I want financial advice, I go to a financial advisor, or, I'll figure it out on my own using AI or something like that. So knowing kind of if this were to happen, one of your clients were to pass away, who gets that first phone call? You want to be one of those first people. And so how do you set yourself up to be that resource so that they don't think, oh, I'm going to go, knee-jerk reaction to my best friend or, ChatGPT or whatever. You want to be in that conversation.
Yeah. I think a lot of advisors, they just want to appease their clients, right? You want to tell them the good things. You end up becoming a service rep for them where they can kind of just boss you around and you do what they say. And I think that is a way to set you up that you're not the person they reach out to. One thing that I've done is, like Lisa was saying, is I get a lot of clients or, somebody signs on and they're like, hey, my spouse doesn't care about money. They don't want to be a part of it. And I say, that's fine, but they have to be on our first call. I can't build I can't help you align your finances, build everything out and plan without knowing what your family wants. And what I found is that most people, they go through life, they're busy, they don't sit down, they don't turn their goals into something concrete in the short term, midterm, long term. They don't talk together necessarily about what worries worries them about money and all that. And by having a first call not be, let me talk about your investments, but it said, let me get to know you so I can tailor my advice to what you're going through and what you're trying to accomplish, has gotten a lot of spouses to buy in that they actually come to all the calls now. And we always lead our agenda with like, what are the topics they sent in that are important to them? So instead of diving into a market commentary, right, we dive into like, here's how you're feeling right now. Here's what you're trying to get done this year. You're thinking about a house project versus investing. And so they start to think of like, my financial advisor helps make the decisions with us. They don't just talk at us about where their money should go. And I think that's the shift in the industry, right? Away from we just manage investments to, kind of we're like this household level CFO. And if your advisor views, or if your client views you in that lens, they're going to call you. If they view you as a money manager, they're not calling you in that moment. There's going to be somebody else they call. And then in reality, they're probably also going to switch advisors because you're not the person that they go to. And, this kind of transitions into this third phase, but no matter how organized you are, this third phase is a nightmare, right? Like you can be organized, but until you have the death certificate, right, you can't really do anything. And then you look and you realize some beneficiary designations were wrong. And then that's kind of a nightmare. And so, like the advisor has to be able to handhold, has to walk them through. But I also think you have that first conversation after is like a, yes, let's empathize with you. There's that whole side, but then it becomes the, how do I level set expectations for you of what this next, 3, 6, and 12 months look like? Because obviously we all know, like, if you have the wrong expectations, it's going to feel way worse. So like just kind of giving them here's what we see happen. Here's the timeline you're going to expect. Here's how it's going to be on life insurance settling and all of that. Like, I feel like advisors can just have a really important role just by hand holding and level setting of what that year looks like.
Yeah. One of the worst things that can happen once a death happens is a surprise to the surviving spouse. If they feel surprised, they feel like I should have known something and you didn't tell me because you had the knowledge, you participated in helping us set up this plan and you had that knowledge, but I didn't get it. That's like kind of that worst kind of breach of trust and the most likely reason they're going to kind of bounce. One of the ways in which I think I've heard it can be a very tough conversation is where the surviving spouse realizes they're living with a marital trust, which is a super common now way of structuring, the inheritance for that spouse. And they think it has something to do. And if you read on the internet, it has everything to do with blended families and control and da 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 da. There's a lot of the negativity of the feeling around why somebody sets up a trust. And I think it can be really hard as an advisor to have that conversation on the back end with the spouse who has to live with one and didn't realize why this was set up. And so I think that's why in phase one, having that conversation so everybody is clear that this isn't necessarily because of a retroactive or, some sort of negative emotion. It's really to protect the whole family and why are we doing this? I think that's really, really important. I think people lose sight, and I've had those conversations as an estate planner that are so awkward. But it's like, we did put in place a marital trust. Let's wind it back. Like, why did we do this? And if you can wind it back to a conversation they participated in, it is so much easier than saying, oh, we just listened to your spouse who's passed away because they participated and you didn't in the conversation. And so, now you're stuck with this. Lisa, I don't know if you have other examples of.
Yeah, I totally. And I think, this is where having the ability to provide flow charts, because obviously, no one's digesting the entirety of their revocable trust or even, all of their era of trust. They're doing it. And then they're saying great, I did it. I don't want to think about that again, until I have more kids or somebody dies. They're just never going to pick that back up and revisit it. So I think, when planners or advisors can provide a flow chart that shows that. And I think that's where, that mechanics of the family trust versus marital trust. When I was in private practice, we'd always highlight hey, you're going to have these two different buckets. They're both for your benefit. You can technically draw from either one, but one is more beneficial because it's going to, whittle down the amount that's exposed to taxes versus the other one that's protected. So let's leave that one alone if you can, and also visualizing you still have your own stuff over here. That just having those kind of visuals that maybe you just remind them of every couple years where they're like, oh yeah. Now I remember we talked about this, it's helpful for tax purposes or whatever. That can be really helpful because no one's picking that trust back up unless they have insomnia and need to get to sleep or something.
For the high net worth clients, we definitely use taxes as a straw man.
Yeah.
Punching bag for those conversations.
Totally. So I think maybe from an advisor's lens, like what does the first year look like? Like what are the touch points? What are the things to get right? And maybe like what are some of the planning opportunities, with still being married, filing joint and things like that?
Yeah, there's a lot to do in the beginning, and then I always feel like it's a little bit of like hurry up and wait in estate administration. There's getting the death certificates, making sure that you're making the necessary tax elections. I always say call the advisor, call the estate planning attorney. I think the best ones that you can work with are going to work cohesively as a team. And, people always say like, how am I going to remember to do all this stuff? You don't have to. Like, that's what professionals are for. They step in, they give you like a little agenda and they say, these are the things we're going to start checking off as we move through this process. If we have to file for probate, we will do that, et cetera. And so it can feel very overwhelming, but that's the reason that you have professional advisors. But yeah, so I would say, getting the death certificates, the CPA or the estate planning attorney is going to look at the tax situation. There's going to be a final tax return that's got to get filed. And then it kind of depends on what the estate plan says happens at that stage. If there's a probate estate that's needed, there's some court procedures that could be involved there. Filing the estate tax return, if there's state estate taxability, that's going to need to be filed. If there's federal, then of course, an estate tax will have to be filed. And those take a long time to clear. I think when I left private practice at the end of last year, it was probably, I think we were on like 2 years was our average turnaround time. Again, it's just a lot of like waiting around for that final closing letter from the IRS. Social Security, making sure Social Security knows that the person has died. Usually like the funeral home or nursing home or things like that will notify, but just making sure that benefits are, stopped or changed as they need to happen. And the other big one I would say is the identity protection piece of like making sure like, okay, we're going to notify like Equifax or TransUnion, those type of agencies so that there's no potential fraud.
Usually there are a lot of checklists, and actually wealth.com has its own, so you can come and ask us for ours. But I would say, what it boils down to is just the more you can take off the plate and also just plan into that year or 2-year timeline so that everyone's clear on the really firm deadlines for things that can only serve you well. As a planner, that should be like right there in terms of like what you can do for that client is talking to their estate planner or, the family, the executor, the trustee, and like making sure everybody's on the same timeline. I think there's this impetus when a death happens of like letting the person grieve. And that can take many forms. There's a lot that's written about that. But the IRS doesn't wait for you to grieve, unfortunately. And so there are things like, for example, you have to actually pay estimated taxes. If you don't know what the actual return will say, there are like firm deadlines on things. So it's like a 9-month ticking clock, like 9 months might be nothing compared to how this person is grieving, but somebody's got to kind of like take that on, the burden of like, let's make sure that we're meeting our deadlines and filing all the paperwork. And that is something that as an advisor, if you step into that void and like want to help that person kind of push things through, I think that can only serve the family well. And they'll remember that. It's annoying because who wants to do the paperwork? But I think that's exactly the feeling that the widow will have, the family members who are grieving. And so if you can take that on for them, I think that can only serve you well.
Yeah. I think some of the other planning things are right. So like we have certain number of time of being married, filing joint. So now we're moving to a single tax bracket. After that, are we thinking about Roth conversions? Do we have a half step up in basis? Do we potentially have a full step up in basis? Does this create a period of time where we reevaluate, like, is that spouse have the same risk tolerance of what their portfolio potentially was? Maybe they're more risk averse and you're using the step up in basis to sell and potentially pay off a mortgage or do different things like that. But I do think it creates some opportunities to re-engage and have some conversations because I haven't really been through it too much. The one person I'm helping through it is still pretty young. They're not using their investments to live off of their life, but I'm sure that might change how they feel. And I'm sure as an advisor, like, was somebody sick and did they have years to plan for this versus it came out of nowhere is really going to change potentially how they think about money and their life moving forward as well. Maybe they care way more about experiences now because they didn't think, life was as fragile as it was. Maybe they think about risk differently. I think there's just a lot of opportunities to kind of re-engage, get to know them and see like, hey, is what we've been doing still right for you after you went through something potentially super traumatic that might change how you view a lot of your life?
I think that's completely right, Thomas. Everything that you knew about the couple needs to be revisited, I think, when you move into that last phase, which is kind of like, now the immediacy of the estate administration, the trust administration is done. Everyone's living with, the sub trusts that were created or whatever else, there are these like legacy investments. It's about re engaging that spouse from the ground up and saying, let's revisit everything. Like, I mean, how many spouses do we know or widows do we know have moved, once their spouse has
Closer
passed
to
away?
kids or something too, probably.
Change beneficiaries, maybe they get more involved in like with a charitable, potential charitable beneficiary. I mean, there are all these, like life altering objectives that might change. And so you need to kind of like re-engage that spouse and come back to what you said earlier, Thomas, about like how do you set up a new relationship with a couple? Now it's resetting up a new relationship with that spouse. How are you feeling? Like, what are your objectives? Like, start from scratch.
Yep. Anything else for this episode you think that we haven't hit on?
We just love questions from the audience, I think. If you have feedback on wanting to dive deeper into the details of an actual trust administration, that's fine. We would be happy to do that. Just let us know.
Love it. Love it. All right, Lisa, thanks for joining us again. And always good to see you. Everybody, please don't forget to rate this podcast 5 stars, share with another advisor who could learn from it. And we'll see you back here in a couple weeks.